1930. America was suffering under the twin disasters of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. During those uncertain times, on the 5th of August, Neil Alden Armstrong was born here in Wapakoneta, Ohio, in America's Midwest.
I do believe my mother was just thrilled, first of all, to have a baby of her very own. My parents were very frugal, but in those days, I think most people were frugal. They were somewhat standoffish as far as showing real deep affection. Were they there for us? Always.
By the age of 5, Armstrong had a younger brother and sister, and not long after, the family moved to the small town of Upper Sandusky in Ohio.
Army planes roaring overhead at the National Air Races in Cleveland, Ohio, thrilled 40,000 spectators.
When he was like 5 years old, his father took him on an airplane ride on a tri-motor. Dad got sick, but Neil just absolutely loved it.
In the mid-1930s, short rides in aircraft such as this Ford tri-motor were a form of entertainment. And as with many children, this first taste of flight for Neil would leave a lasting impression. By the time he was 15, and enthused by exploits of World War II pilots, he'd begun to take flying lessons at his local airfield. But Armstrong saw no need to tell his family about it. In an interview recorded in 2001, Armstrong recalled the time.
Do you remember your first solo flight when you actually could be up in the air on your own?
Yeah, I have vague recollections of
Where
very
was that
exciting
flight?
time when you're going your first solo. The license you got was called a student pilot's license, which allowed you to fly solo but not take passengers.
He had his pilot's license before he had his driver's license.
Armstrong's first flights coincided with a series of extraordinary advances in aviation technology. Since the Second World War, engineers had been pushing the development of aircraft so far that now not even the sound barrier stood in their way. In October 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the speed of sound in his Bell X-1 rocket plane. The Cold War was underway. Armstrong, keen to pursue a career in aeronautical engineering, won a Navy scholarship to study the subject at Purdue University. But then everything changed as the Cold War began to get hotter. The 20-year-old Armstrong became a Navy pilot. After intense training, he joined Squadron VF-51 on the aircraft carrier USS Essex. There was a lot to learn, and fast. But the skills he'd honed would make him one of the best pilots of his generation.
But we had to become carrier qualified in the jet aircraft, doing a lot of practice with weapons delivery, instrument flying, and so on. I was very young, very green.
The carrier was a dangerous environment. On the 16th of September 1951, this accident on the Essex killed 7 sailors. Below deck, Armstrong had a narrow escape. It was not his first brush with death. Armstrong had flown 78 missions over Korea. He was now a skilled and experienced pilot at the age of just 22. He returned from Korea in 1952 as the Cold War arms race was reaching ever higher, with each superpower racing to launch its nuclear warheads on more and more powerful rockets. But back at Purdue University, this young man of few words had other things on his mind.
Well, I met him at Purdue. He told someone that I was the one he was going to marry, but he never asked me out until he had graduated. We were married in January 1956, and after that, in May, we went up to the desert.
With his degree in aeronautical engineering and his military flight experience, Armstrong landed a job as a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base in California. It was here that the very latest planes were being developed. And for Armstrong, it was the perfect opportunity to develop his talents further.
We were out at the edges of the flight envelope all the time, testing limits. If memory serves, there were 17 aircraft, pretty much all different. A lot of ex-airplanes and fighters, and a B-47 and a couple of B-29s, and all kinds of exotic aircraft. And as they became more confident of my abilities, they gave me more and more jobs. And I did a lot of different test programs in those days. And then finally, I was flying the X-15.
And uphill at 33,000 feet.
The rocket-powered X-15 was the pinnacle of aviation technology and the fastest plane in the world. Only the very best pilots got to fly it.
The X-15 was absolutely the top of the line. It was a whole supersonic zone above the rest of us, and therefore all the people who flew the X-15 were held in the highest regard by the rest of us peasants. And Neil, of course, was one of that group.
That was a very exciting program, challenging goals. I think it was certainly one of the memorable parts of my life.
For Janet, life in the desert would prove equally challenging.
It was totally different, foreign to anything I'd ever known in my life. And then I got pregnant. So we bought a house up in the hills. That's where we lived when Rick was born. And then shortly thereafter, Karen.
I think he was absolutely thrilled with Karen. He called her Muffy. And she was the sweetest little toddler you would ever want to hold.
In 1961, Karen fell seriously ill.
Karen was a precious thing, and she developed a tumor in her brain. She was just barely 2. And we could not save her. We did everything we could for her.
Karen died on the 28th of January 1962.
The death of Karen really hurt him. It was the only time that I had ever seen him really, really hurt. Couldn't talk about it.
Armstrong focused back on his work, pushing himself and the fearsome X-15 to the limit.
I got the nose up above the horizon, and I found I was actually skipping outside of the atmosphere where I had no aerodynamic controls.
Soaring out of the atmosphere at almost a mile a second, Armstrong was unable to keep control.
What I couldn't do is get back down in the atmosphere. I pulled over and pulled down, but it wasn't going down because there was no air to bite into. So I just had to wait until I got back in with enough air to have aerodynamic control and some lift on the wings, and immediately started making a turn back.
Armstrong had touched the edge of space, making the longest ever X-15 flight, 180 miles in just over 11 minutes. But beyond the skies of Edwards, a new generation of pilots were flying so high that the world had christened them spacemen.
All right, lift off and the clock has started.
The space race had pitched America against Russia, but by 1962 the Russians were ahead, and President Kennedy set a new, ambitious goal.
Before the end of the 60s, we will see a man to the moon, an American, and we're very proud that our country continues to produce these young men who go so far and carry with them so much.
70 seconds, leaving a nice paper trail now. Looks real fine.
To meet Kennedy's challenge, NASA went looking for more astronauts.
Looks good.
Along with Janet, Rick, and a new son, Mark, Neil began a new life in Houston, Texas, home to America's rapidly growing space program.
It was a nice house. It had we had a pool.
Because it was Houston, because it was often very hot, there was a lot of swimming.
The full risks of the space program would be brought home less than a year later in January 1967, with the deaths of 3 astronauts in a fire on board the Apollo 1 spacecraft. Armstrong found himself burying his close friend Ed White, who died along with Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee. No Americans would fly into space for almost 2 years. But after a series of unmanned test flights of the Saturn V moon rocket, NASA was ready to launch men into space again. The first men to ride this giant rocket went straight into orbit around the moon on Apollo 8. Armstrong was the backup commander and watched closely from mission control. This guaranteed him command of a following mission, and as luck would have it, that was Apollo 11. Part of the preparations to attempt to land on the moon required Armstrong to fly a lunar landing training vehicle, affectionately known as the Flying Bedstead.
It was difficult to fly, but on the other hand, I think we all felt that absolutely mandatory to be able to fly that type vehicle before you go to the moon.
On one of Armstrong's flights, a failure of the fuel system suddenly caused the craft to tilt. He only had a second to decide what to do. It was yet another close call for the fast-thinking astronaut, escaping with only minor injuries. Back at work the next day, Armstrong's training continued. The pace was relentless as he prepared for that first step he would take on the moon. As launch day approached, there was one last thing to do for the family, and the reserved engineer prepared for it in the only way he knew how.
I do remember a meeting. We had a family meeting before he left, but it was sort of a Q&A type meeting where he did say, there is some risk in this mission and we're confident that we're going to at least get back, but that might not happen.
July the 16th, 1969, Cape Kennedy. Over 1 million people came to watch Apollo 11 leave for the moon.
All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
It would take 4 days for Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin to get to the moon. Then would come an attempt to pull off one of the most audacious achievements in human history.
Without a doubt, powered descent and landing successfully is what it was all about. That's what the president said. Land a man on the moon and bring him back safely.
We're certainly aware that the nation's hopes largely rested on us doing the very best job we could.
Armstrong's job was now to fly the lunar module for the first time in his life, and land it successfully.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Vital.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Ecom.
Go.
Surgeon.
Go.
Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle Houston, you're go for landing, over.
Working around the broken communication links and the computer alarms, Armstrong was now just 2,000 feet above the lunar surface.
Oh, I was in my bedroom. We were tracking it on a map as they pointed out verbally where they were.
75 feet. Car's looking good. Down a half. It's forward.
60 seconds.
60 seconds.
With the fuel starting to get low, Armstrong was still looking for a safe place to touch down.
It was a fairly steep slope, and it was covered with very big rocks, and it just wasn't a good place to land.
Pretty rocky area.
That's why he had to hover around there to find a good spot to put down.
Looks like a good area here.
I wanted to make it as easy for myself as I could.
We got a good spot here.
There's a lot of concern about coming close to running out of fuel.
Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. 30 down a half.
With only 30 seconds of fuel left, the landing hinged on the unflappable test pilot turned astronaut.
I was sure he was going to do it.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Engine arm off. We've had shutdown.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
I was in orbit, of course, when they landed, and I was delighted they were down and safe on the surface. I gave a little sigh of relief.
With Apollo 11 safely down, press attention turned to the astronauts' wives.
And every time a door opened, you know, some press person would rush up with a camera and get, who was that? Who was that? And all of this kind of thing.
And what they all wanted to ask Janet was what Neil would say when he first stepped out.
Do you have any inkling what he's going to say? He wouldn't tell us when he steps out on the moon.
No, I have no idea what he's going to say, but whatever he says, I'm sure it will be worthwhile.
Armstrong always said he'd thought up his famous words after landing on the moon. But his brother Dean remembers it differently.
Before he went to the Cape, he invited me down to be with him and spend a little time with him. He said, well, why don't you and I, when the boys go to bed, why don't we play a game of Risk? I said, well, I'd enjoy that. We started playing Risk. And then he slipped me a piece of paper and said, read that. And I did. And on that piece of paper, there was, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. He says, what do you think about that? I said, fabulous. He said, I thought you might like that, but I wanted you to read it. That's one small step for a man. Okay.
Prepared with the words that history would best remember him for, Armstrong started down the ladder.
And we're getting a picture on the TV. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Yeah, I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I was pretty close to him when he said that.
There you go.
He was really surprising in how he would say just the right thing at the right time.
Oh, it's overjoy. You know, unbelievable. I've never had such great feelings in my life.
Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Finally, it began to sink in with me. That really is another planet.
Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. I believe they're setting up the flag now.
At last, after the years of preparation, the launch and the landing, the first two human beings on the moon could simply marvel at this strange environment.
Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
The 2.5-hour moonwalk passed all too quickly. And soon it was time to come home, as the pair climbed back inside their spacecraft.
We'd like to say from all of us in all the countries and in the entire world, we think that you've done a magnificent job up there today. Thank you. Couldn't enjoy it as much as we did. It was great.
He got me there. He got me back safe. And I made a couple of mistakes. Fortunately, they were not that crucial. And I'm not going to tell you about them.
A brief period in quarantine would be the crew's only respite before an extraordinary madness began. Armstrong, the humble aeronautical engineer and test pilot from small-town Ohio, was about to have his life utterly transformed.
We did New York, Chicago, and LA all in one day. There was thousands and thousands of people. And people from windows above and apartments and so on. It was fabulous. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before in my life or ever had done before in my life. We were in open cars, open convertibles.
I can remember, I'm in the car and I'm waving and I'm like, oh, I didn't do anything. I'm not sure why I'm in here.
The schedule was punishing, with the astronauts forced into the role of international ambassadors. Together with their wives, they visited 23 countries in just 45 days. Their mission now was to shake hands with the world, and everyone was eager to meet the first man on the moon.
We went to each country, and it would be, of course, a huge welcome at the airport, which called for a speech, a huge luncheon or something, which called for a speech, and then there would be the major state dinner, which called for a speech. And I always felt that Neil had the responsibility, the burden, if you will, of always saying the perfect thing. He was the star, but I have to say he had a pretty darn good supporting cast.
This was the beginning. This is the beginning of it all. But there was nothing you could do. I mean, these people were just happy to see you.
None of us had married an astronaut. And here were our husbands all of a sudden, and the people are calling and saying, oh, we want an interview.
People wanted a piece of him. I either want your autograph or I want my picture taken with you. And I think that it wasn't just anyone, it was everyone.
Such an intense level of intrusion into Armstrong's life would eventually start to take its toll on him and his family.
To be out to dinner and sort of minding your own business and to have people come in, looking at you going, that's who that is, and coming over and may I have your autograph, please, after a while. Even if they do it in the nicest possible way, which many of them did, still, it just wears you out after a while.
And he really didn't know what he wanted to do. Also, that was a problem. What am I going to do now? What can I do?
In 1971, Armstrong resigned from NASA. It seemed there were no greater challenges left. He could fly no higher and no faster than he'd already flown. He chose instead to pursue his first love, aircraft design, and accepted a professorship at the University of Cincinnati, back in his home state.
Well, we were looking for a place to live, and he wanted to live out in the country. I guess he wanted to escape people. He wanted privacy.
The Armstrongs bought this secluded farm in Ohio. It was a radical change of lifestyle, and not just for Neil.
Life on the farm was very quiet. We had 200 and some acres of land, and we had maybe 100 head of cattle, and we raised crops.
I kept thinking, I wonder how they manage this. And Neil sat there and prefaced his remarks by saying, well, I do have a very competent farm manager. And then I realized later that the good, competent farm manager was Janet.
I ended up taking over the management of the farm.
I'm not sure that Mom really wanted the farm life, but she did very well, and she was a trooper.
While Janet dealt with the farm, Neil turned his attention to teaching. But escaping his fame was never going to be easy.
Whenever Neil Armstrong came onto the campus, there were a number of rather interesting reactions.
Well, the first day was rather chaotic. As class was letting out, the media was massed outside the classroom, and he did in fact push the students out of the classroom and then quickly closed the door with himself inside the classroom.
Eventually, behind the closed doors of academia, Armstrong found refuge from the consequences of his fame.
I began to think of him as simply Neil, not as Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon. I just thought of him as Neil.
But outside university, the burden of celebrity still sat uncomfortably with him.
He was given the credit, and he didn't think he deserved it all.
Armstrong eventually opted for a pragmatic approach, shunning the limelight and rationing interviews, which led to the media unfairly branding him a recluse.
He just didn't feel the need to notify the media about what he was doing, you know. So a media recluse maybe, but that's a completely different thing.
Struggling with the never-ending burden of being the first man on the moon, Armstrong coped in the only way he knew how, throwing himself deeper into his work, just as he'd done in the past. In 1979, he left the university in search of new opportunities, this time in the world of business.
Chrysler 550 protection plan.
He even ventured into the world of advertising.
Unexpected repair bills for 5 years or 50,000 miles. It protects you longer than any other American car maker's plan.
His calendar was double parked all the time.
He was gone during the week, and he'd be home on the weekends, and he really didn't want to work on the farm on the weekends. He wanted, to do things with the boys and so on and so forth, and I did too.
I think that, that she had hoped that at some point Dad would work a little less and they might be able to do some things that they'd always wanted to do. But he was a workaholic. And so it was, I think, Dad's strong work ethic and Mom's isolation on the farm that eventually came between them.
Janet and Neil separated in 1990, divorcing 4 years later.
The breakup between he and Janet was devastating to him. So I think for several years, he just was miserable.
I just think it sort of opened his eyes a little bit and made him aware that he didn't have to work all the time. And that was very good for him. It put him in a great position to meet other people.
During his later years, Armstrong finally began to ease up, swapping endless rounds in the boardroom for rounds on the golf course with his sons. And it was during a golfing breakfast in 1992 that his life would take another direction on meeting Carol Knight.
And a few weeks later, somebody called and they had a really quiet voice. And I said, "Who is this?" And he said, "Well, it's Neil." And I said, "Neil who?" It didn't dawn on me he'd be calling. And he said, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, actually, I was outside trying to cut down this dead cherry tree." And then he sprang to life because he's a farmer, and he said, "Oh, I can do that." So he was at the house in a half hour.
2 years after meeting, Neil asked Carol to marry him.
He liked good wine and good food, and I liked to cook, and, you know, it was mellow.
You know, in the last 10, 15 years, I just feel like there was just a general lightening up in all aspects of his interactions with people. So.
Dr. Neil Armstrong, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much. The method we use to descend from orbit to the surface of an alien world worked. But it would have been far more efficient and far less traumatic if we could just be beamed down.
All the men have certainly, as we say quietly, mellowed so that they're more relaxed, they're more ready to just spend time doing something just for fun.
Armstrong turned 80 in 2010, and Carol decided to do something special to mark it.
His 80th birthday party, I thought we could have a surprise party, it would be a lot of fun. And I had about 250 people on a list because her friends are spread all over the country. I think he was surprised. He put on a good act if he wasn't. We had a great time. He was grinning ear to ear. And then by the end of the evening, he was playing the piano, and he asked somebody to have me come up front, and I didn't know why. So I went up front, but I sat down, and he was serenading me.
Precious days I'll spend.
And then every guy in the audience was mad at him.
On the 7th of August 2012, Neil Armstrong was admitted to hospital for heart surgery. He remained there until his death on August the 25th.
If there's a legacy, I think he may have left it already. He very much wanted the exploration of space to be an accomplishment that was important for this planet and everyone on it.
It's overwhelming to think about how much has come from that inspiration.
If there was something that he could pass along to future generations, I think it would be the conviction to do the right thing.
One thing, he was true to himself. He was the man that you saw. That was him.